In the last video, we looked at what a literature review is and why we need a literature review in our research. We also touched briefly on how to create a literature review. This video, we'll look in more detail about creating a literature review. The first step then is to find information sources. A few weeks ago we talked about different ways we could identify information sources, and you will remember this slide from then. Once you've identified a selection of information sources, you need to decide whether to include them or exclude them, and you can set up your own criteria for this. On the screen there's an example of some of the criteria you may use, and we've already discussed these in a previous lecture. We now have a pile of information sources that we want to use in our research, but we have to evaluate how useful they're going to be. We can use this slide to identify the different questions we need to ask of the literature. Authority. The person writing the article, are they an expert on the subject? Are they just a journalist with no special knowledge of the topic? Because that will affect how much you can rely on the content. Currency. How up to date is the information? Is it relevant for now, for today, and for your research? Relevance. Does the literature cover the areas that you need covering as part of your research? Is it relevant to your question or your aim? Objectivity. Is it objective or is it biased? If the article you're using is biased, you're still welcome to use the article, but you must bear in mind the potential problems with that literature. And finally, supporting evidence. Is there evidence that backs up what they're saying? Have they given references that can be checked to make sure it's accurate? And these points will help you to evaluate the sources that you're going to use in your literature review. So, secondary research, the literature review. This is the starting point for any research. There's no point in spending a lot of time asking people questions or investigating something if the information has already been gathered or the statistics are available. Once you've found an article you think is useful to your research, you need to summarise what it says. A summary of the literature or an overview of the literature is really what a literature review is. In order to do that, you need to analyse the literature, in other words, break down the content, and then synthesise it. In other words, put it back together again, but in a more easy to follow way. How we organise these summaries can help or hinder our research, and so we need to look at one way to analyse the literature and synthesise the content. The first step is to identify the main themes within your research and reading. This is the main topic areas. For example, if you're researching the value of work experience when studying, you might want to consider the views of the different people involved, the employers, the students, and the institution. So those could become your themes. Then you draw up a grid to summarise your findings. So here's an example of a grid. It has those three themes we've identified. It also has space for the author, the date, and the type of publication the information is taken from. So once you have your themes, you can draw up a grid to record the content of the literature. Here are 3 short clips from articles on the topic of studying and working and placements. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause the video so that you can read the content. Pause the video. Okay, so looking at this literature, if we read the first item, we can see that one of the things it's talking about is that students are opting for work experience. So from the student perspective, they want work experience. Another thing we can see here is that students are suffering from a shortage of money, and these financial demands are putting pressure on them to take up work while they're studying. We could go through all of the extracts, identifying the main points from the different authors' views. And when we do that, we can then put them into this table. Your literature matrix table might look something like the one below, and you can see the blue square is the information that we've already identified in the last slide. There are 2 important things that you might note here. The first thing is that the articles are listed in date order, in chronological order. The second is that not every book or article will cover all the themes. This is perfectly okay. You wouldn't expect everybody to cover your themes. So once we've broken down the literature into these different sections or themes, it's possible to use the literature to organise or reorganise your information by theme. So we could have a paragraph or a section referring to the views of the employer, and then another one referring to the views of students, and then a third one looking at the different institutional views. So we can look down the columns and compare and contrast what the authors have written. Where they agree, we need to acknowledge that. Where they disagree, we also need to recognise that. And we need to try and find reasons for possible disagreement. Is it something that's changed over time, or does it depend on the sample that they've used, or what other reason for any differences? Once we're doing this, we can write it up as a literature review. Pause for a moment and read this. This should organise the information in a better way to the previous slide, because it's focusing on a theme for each paragraph rather than just what somebody said. So if you want to understand, for example, the student views, all of the different opinions of authors are in the same paragraph with a comparison. Okay, so you should note that this literature review has a summary of each theme. It compares the views of the authors and tries to find reasons for any differences in their findings. It also shows that there's been an evaluation of the different sources. This is what your literature review should be like. Okay, so let's look at the methodology then. How do you write up your secondary methodology? The same 5 categories are showing on this slide and should be included within your methodology as when we did primary methodology. But here, if we've chosen to do secondary, we need to explain and justify that. So why have we chosen to do secondary research? What sort of literature are we going to look at? Are we looking at quantitative numbers or qualitative ideas? In the construction section, we need to indicate what evaluation criteria we've applied, and also we need to think about the benefits and drawbacks of the different information sources. The sample section is where we make it clear how we chose which articles to include or exclude. The procedure section identifies the actual process that we went through. In this case, it was to create a literature matrix, identifying the themes, labelling the columns, and summarising the content of the articles. And then finally, you need to consider the analysis. How are you going to use the literature in the literature review and also in the discussion? You'll have different types of information. You may have found some numerical data from past research, perhaps from a market research report, and you may have to reanalyse the data to make it useful to your research question. So how are you going to analyse the information? Are you going to use charts and tables? Are you going to compare and contrast different viewpoints around the framework you identified in the literature review? Are you going to use quantitative information to support your discussion and ideas? You need in here to have thought about how you will use the literature. Okay, so that's a very quick look at the secondary research methodology contents and what goes into each section. Just bear in mind also that if you are only doing secondary research, your discussion will also be a literature review. So in your literature review section, you will provide an overview of a framework that you're going to use, and then your discussion will be working through the different objectives that you set yourself in order to achieve your aim, and drawing on the framework that you've already identified.